In this tutorial, we're going to start discussing having high poly and low poly versions of our models. How do we go in and take a model that was built simple with game art in mind, and how do we make a higher resolution version of it? We're going to primarily be using a technique called subdivision surfaces. But first, before we even do that, we need to do a little file management. So I'm going to come up here and say Tools, Scene Explorer. And I have this head mesh selected. So let's go ahead and I'm going to rename it by going up to Name and Color, highlighting that, and just typing in a name for it. In this case, I'm going to call it Lego_LP. And then I'll come up here to this thing up at the top. It says Create Selection SE. That actually, it's cutting off the TS. It's name selection sets. And so you can just type in there LP and hit enter. And now if you click over to the side, it says create selection sets. If I click, it's going to show me that LP right there. And so you can create your own selection groupings inside there and name them anything that you want. And so it's helpful to have a separation of what we call low poly and a high poly model. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and say here under transform, I'm going to go down to clone. I'm going to set my clone type to copy. I'm going to change the name to Lego_HP, and that's going to stand for high poly. So you'll see over here in my Scene Explorer, I have two different models, my Lego LP and Lego HP. I'm going to hide the LP, and I don't need my reference plane anymore, so I'll just delete that. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll select the HP. And I'm going to come over here to modify. And I want to make sure that this is not an instance. I can double check to make sure it's not an instance by looking at this center button. It says make unique. I can't click on that because this already is a unique object. So one of the things you do is you have a low poly game res mesh, and then you may want a high res mesh for generating surface data, like in the form of textures. So in this case, if we want to increase the resolution on this, there's a number of ways. There's modifiers in here called, I'm looking for, it's called Mesh Smooth, which will go through and you can see it smoothed out the model. All right. There's different ways that you can control this. The default is NURMS, that's non-uniform rational mesh smooth. You come down to quad output, which you really don't see a big difference. There's also classic, right? And you can see classic basically just doubles everything up. So you tend to see, you get weird artifacts at the bottom where I'm going to turn off the eyeball. You can see it's having a hard time kind of smoothing that out because it's just an open polygon there. So let's turn this off. And so I will point out that there are some good settings here before I do that, like under parameters, you can smooth by smoothing groups. And so you can see that here where the smoothing groups on the head are, it is, you know, it does stop and then go up, but you can see how it's kind of bending it in and deforming it. So before you go in and try anything like just putting a mesh smooth on, there's another option where if you're at the edit poly, that's the bottommost component of your mesh, there's a rollout here called subdivision surfaces that show up. And so if I come into use NURMS subdivision and I check that, I see my mesh smoothed out. Anytime you have that on, you want to make sure that you don't right click and convert to edit poly, because that'll make what you've done to your mesh permanent, in which case it's going to double the amount of polygons. Really the thing I want to talk about primarily though, beyond all that, is just how do we keep this from turning to mush? And that comes in, you see how the model at this point, when you go to, it's trying to kind of blend it right here, right? Like it's curving it out. And so what we do is we go in and we sort of define edges to get them to preserve. So one way you can do that is I'm going to come in here to edge. In the past, we've gone through and selected an edge and hit ring, and then we've used connect if I open up connect. Now you can come in and you can increase the number of segments, and we haven't used that this much, but there's other options here like pinch. And if I click and drag this up, you can see how I can kind of pinch them out. So why don't I kind of pinch that out there. And now if I turn on NURMS, let's use NURMS, you can see how it's doing a better job, right? There's doing a better job of preserving that edge and still smoothing out the model. So it'll do an even better job if we come down here and hit ring. And again, I could use connect, and maybe I don't want to get an outer edge out here. Maybe that one isn't as important. Maybe I just leave it at one segment, at which point I could use slide to move it in. Right? And so now that I've really defined that edge there, let's turn NURMS on. You can see how it's really preserving that edge very nicely. Now there are some shortcuts when you go to do this kind of work. There's some additional tools in here that's going to help that out. If I come up here to, I believe it's edit, yep, there's a tool called Swift Loop. So I'm going to activate that. And you see as I come out here, as I come over edges, you see how it's putting this sort of highlighted line in? It only works on edges that are going through four-sided intersections. So that's why it stops up here, because it's a triangle. But what I could do is if I just come in, I can define that edge right there. And then if I kind of orbit around my model, I can look for other spots where I want to do that. So it's a little tricky to kind of get this tool right where you want it. So you got to be careful. Be prepared to undo in case you get it in the wrong spot. Maybe I'll preserve this one. But basically you want to bracket any corners so that they got like a little edge on either side of them to help preserve them. And maybe we'll even put one like right here where this curve starts. The top and bottom of the head there. All right. So let's, I'm going to right click to get out of that mode. And now if I turn on NURMS, you can see when I click off, there's like an orange, sort of this orange cage. You can see the original mesh. If I just come over here to create, you won't even see that anymore. So now you can see that there's actually a little bit of you can kind of see a little bit of a highlight there. I wonder how this would look if we got rid of that one edge that I put in. So let's turn this off. I'm going to come up here to loops and use remove loop. Now get rid of both edges and vertex points. Let's do that for the other edge that I swift looped in. And so the question of where do I need to bracket in? Where do I need to put these in? The answer to that is really anywhere where your model is losing its form. So let's turn on NURMS and then come back out. And I feel like it looks better without those ones that I had in there previously. Now you can kind of see how the model it's higher resolution. It looks nicer, and this gives me a nice high-res version. Now, I would save this. I'll show you here. Let's clone this as a copy. I'm going to move it over to the side just to show you. So if I come in and do anything else, like if I put, say, another edit polygon, you can see that my mesh, the number of polygons has doubled on it. Because that's sort of what NURMS is doing. It's going through and it's sort of doubling everything out and deforming the mesh in order to smooth out the overall shape of it. Okay, that's pretty much what's happening here. And so if you go ahead and do anything else to your model, like if you go in, for example, and say convert to edit poly while NURMS is on, it'll go through and it'll make that change permanent, and so you'll now have all these edges. So you want to be careful that you're not baking your meshes down with NURMS turned on, because you may not want that. Now, if you really want to get it to be extra smooth, you can actually turn it on, and it'll remember that. So then it's even smoother. So, but that may not be a clean way to do it. That may not be what you're looking for, but the general idea here is you're going to end up with two different versions of your model. Let's delete this test one. And they need to kind of sit within the same location. Like here's my low poly, and here's my high poly. Now we're going to use these high poly, low poly models for texture generation in later, in the weeks to come. So we're going to practice this process of making high-res meshes. So you'll want to save this, and you're going to want to turn this in. And remember, the important thing is make sure that when you're working with NURMS, that you're working on unique objects and not instances, and that you're also naming your objects and keeping them organized. Previously, just remembering this, I did show you name selection sets. Let's go ahead and let's make one for our high poly, HP. And so now there's our HP1. And so if we have them both visible, we can select the high poly and hide it. Now we're working with our low poly. If we want to grab our high poly, we can go. And it'll give you a warning saying, hey, that object is hidden or frozen. Do you want me to see it? And you say yes, then it'll show up and you can right click and say hide unselected and your high poly is selected. So that's the process of creating high poly meshes using NURMS.